Everyone wears a mask, but what happens when it finally slips? We explore the duality of human nature and the hidden faces we show only to the shadows. Click subscribe now to see the real person behind the mask in every story.
Morning of my surgery, I woke up at 4:47 a.m. and reached for my husband's side of the bed. It was cold. Not the kind of cold from someone who'd gotten up early to make coffee, the kind of cold that meant he hadn't slept there at all. I told myself he'd fallen asleep on the couch again. I told myself a lot of things that year. His name was Colin. We'd been married 9 years. He was a project manager at a mid-size construction firm. Charming at dinner parties, good with numbers, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order but forgot your ultrasound appointment. We had a son, Eli, who was 7, gap-toothed, obsessed with dinosaurs, and deeply, profoundly convinced that his father hung the moon. And for a long time, I believed that too. I'd been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer 8 months before the surgery. I want to say that word out loud, cancer, because for the first 3 months after my diagnosis, I couldn't. I type it in medical forms and feel my chest constrict. I'd hear my oncologist say it and watch her mouth move like I was underwater. Colin was there for the diagnosis. He held my hand in the car afterward. He said all the right things. "We'll get through this together. You're the strongest person I know. I'm not going anywhere." He was lying about the last one. My name is Serena. I'm 39 years old. I work as a hospital pharmacist, which means I spent the year of my own cancer treatment explaining other people's prescriptions while quietly filling my own. I knew what every medication did, what every side effect meant, which combinations were dangerous. What I did not know, what no pharmacology textbook covers, is how to recognize that your husband of 9 years is planning his exit while you're scheduling your mastectomy. I handled everything. That became the pattern so early in our marriage that I stopped noticing it as unusual. I managed our finances, paid the bills on auto schedule, tracked the mortgage, filed our taxes. Colin made more money than me in pure salary, but I was the one who knew where every dollar lived. He would hand me his paycheck summary each month with the casual energy of someone dropping laundry in front of a hamper, trusting it would be dealt with, and I dealt with it. For 9 years, I dealt with it. When I got sick, the load didn't redistribute. It just pressed heavier onto the same side. I drove myself to most of my chemo appointments because Colin had conflicts. I set up Eli's school carpool for the days I knew I'd be wiped out. I wrote detailed grocery lists with instructions on which brands to buy because when I sent Colin without a list, he came back with the wrong cereal and no vegetables and looked genuinely proud of himself. I organized my own medical leave paperwork. I scheduled the surgery, pre-op appointments, and post-op care. I arranged for my mother to fly in from Phoenix for the recovery week. 3 nights before my surgery, I came downstairs at midnight because I couldn't sleep. My laptop was open on the kitchen counter. Colin had left a browser tab open. I don't think he knew I'd come down. It was an Airbnb confirmation. Las Vegas, check-in, the day after my surgery, 2 guests. His name. And a name I didn't recognize, Justine. I stood there in the dark kitchen for a very long time. I closed the tab. I went back upstairs. I lay in the bed where my husband was finally deeply asleep. And I stared at the ceiling, and I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with cancer cells. It was a quiet, precise, almost surgical kind of clarity. I did not wake him. I did not cry. I made a mental note the way I made mental notes at work. Critical information, flagged, set aside for when I could act on it without error. The surgery was on a Thursday. I checked in at 6 a.m. Colin drove me. He sat in the pre-op waiting area with his phone and a paper cup of bad hospital coffee, and he kissed my forehead when they wheeled me back and said, "You've got this." I searched his face for something. Guilt, maybe. A flicker of the man who'd held my hand in the parking lot after my diagnosis. He looked tired. That was all. I don't remember the surgery, obviously. I remember waking up in recovery with my mouth tasting like copper and a nurse named Peggy who had a kind face and told me everything had gone well. I asked for my phone before I asked for water. Old habits. There were 2 texts from Colin. One said he'd had to step out for a bit but would be back. The second, sent 3 hours later, said, "Something came up. Your mom is on her way. You're in good hands. You're stronger than you think." My mother arrived from Phoenix looking like she'd run through the airport, which she had. She sat by my bed and held my hand and didn't ask about Colin. and I loved her for that. She just talked about Eli, about a drawing he'd done at school, about how he'd asked her to save him some of the dinosaur chicken nuggets specifically. She kept talking until I stopped shaking. I found out later, much later, through a series of small discoveries I will explain, that Colin had left the hospital approximately 90 minutes after I went into surgery. He caught a noon flight to Las Vegas. He checked into the Airbnb on the Strip with Justine, who turned out to be a marketing coordinator at a firm that had done some contract work with his company. They'd been involved for at least 7 months. I would eventually find receipts going back further than that, but 7 months is what I can confirm. My mother stayed for 10 days. Colin came home on Sunday 4 days after my surgery. He walked in with a rolling carry-on and a slightly sunburned nose and said he was sorry. Work had been a crisis. He felt terrible. He should have been there. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea my mother had made me, still in my surgical recovery stage, still in pain that I was not showing. I looked at him. He looked back, and I said very calmly, "How was Las Vegas?" The color left his face so fast it was almost interesting from a clinical standpoint. He said, "What?" I said, "Las Vegas." "How was it?" He started to say he didn't know what I was talking about, which was such an insult to both of us that I held up one hand and he stopped talking. I told him I wanted him to sleep in the guest room that night, that I was not going to have this conversation while I was still on pain medication, and that he should think carefully about what he wanted to say to me before we spoke again. He slept in the guest room. He did not, apparently, think carefully enough. When we finally talked 4 days later, Eli at school, my mother diplomatically taking a very long walk. Colin's explanation was the one I had braced for, and somehow still wasn't ready to receive. He loved me, but he'd felt alone during my illness, but the marriage had been struggling for years, but he hadn't meant for things to go this far, but Justine was, and here he actually paused like he was going to say something meaningful, different. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, the table I'd picked out, the house I'd largely managed for 7 years, and I listened to him explain how lonely he'd been while I was fighting cancer. I noted, internally, that he did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about my recovery. He did not mention Eli once in the first 20 minutes of talking. Every sentence began with "I" and ended with a justification. I had been a pharmacist for 12 years. I understood chemistry. I understood that certain compounds, when mixed, produce reactions that cannot be undone. I understood that timing matters enormously, that you do not administer a powerful agent until the conditions are right. I had been managing our finances for 9 years. I want to be clear, I did not do anything illegal. I did not do anything vindictive for its own sake. What I did was simply stop performing a service I had been providing for free for nearly a decade, and allow the natural consequences of that to occur. Our mortgage was in both names. I had been the one making payments, on time, every single month, from the joint account I managed. Our joint account, which I had signature authority over. Colin's salary was direct deposited there. Mine was too. 6 days after Colin's confession, I opened my own personal account at a different bank. I transferred my direct deposit. I did not touch Colin's funds. I am not a thief. But I stopped covering the mortgage from the joint account because I had been covering it from my money flowing through there, and I no longer saw a reason to do that. I redirected my contributions to my own account and a separate emergency fund for Eli. I also reached out to a divorce attorney named Catherine, who was recommended by a colleague, and who turned out to be exceptionally good at her job. I did not tell Colin any of this. What happened next unfolded on its own schedule, the way things do when you stop holding them together by sheer force of will. The mortgage payment was missed, then a second one. Colin received notices I had previously intercepted and handled. He called me, confused, asking if something was wrong with the account. I told him he should probably look into it. He had never set up online banking alerts because I had always managed that. He did not know the login. He called the bank. They explained to him that the account had a balance insufficient to cover the payment. He came to me looking shaken in a way I had not seen before, not the flustered guilt of a man caught in a lie, but the specific panic of someone who has never had to think about money and has suddenly discovered the floor was never solid. "Why isn't there money in the account?" he asked. I said, "Because I stopped putting mine in. This is what the account looks like without my contributions." He stared at me for a long time. I think it was the first time in our marriage he had genuinely understood something about how we worked. The divorce proceedings were not simple, because they never are. Catherine was methodical and calm and very good at her job. Colin hired an attorney who was noticeably less good at his. There was the house. I did not want it. I wanted a clean exit and a fair settlement. There was Eli, and those conversations were the hardest of everything, much harder than the financial negotiations, much harder than explaining to mutual friends what had happened. Telling your 7-year-old son that his parents are not going to live together anymore is a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a comparison. Eli took it the way 7-year-olds take things, in waves. Some days he seemed completely fine, and other days he'd ask me at bedtime, very quietly, if Daddy had left because of something Eli did. Those nights I would lie down next to him in his dinosaur print sheets, and I would tell him, with everything I had, no. Absolutely not. And I would stay until he fell asleep, even on nights when I was exhausted from treatment follow-ups, even on nights I could barely stay upright. Colin saw Eli on weekends. It was initially contentious, then it settled. Colin, to his credit, was better as a part-time father than he'd been as a full-time husband, more present, maybe, when presence was a choice rather than a default obligation. What I found 3 months into the proceedings, while going through a box of files from Colin's home office that Catherine had advised me to inventory, was a folder I had never seen. It was tucked behind old tax documents from 2018, which is a choice that in retrospect tells you everything about his confidence, that I'd never dig that far back. Inside was a credit card statement in his name only, from an account I hadn't known existed. 12 months of charges. Hotels. Dinners. Weekends away. It went back further than 7 months. Significantly further. I sat on the floor of his empty office for a long time with that folder in my hands. I wasn't crying. I was past that. I was doing the kind of quiet arithmetic that happens when you finally have the number you suspected but didn't want to confirm. The affair hadn't started because I got sick. It had started long before my diagnosis. He had held my hand in the parking lot after I heard the word cancer for the first time in relation to my own body, and he had already been with someone else. He had said, "I'm not going anywhere," while actively planning somewhere to go. The settlement Catherine negotiated included that credit card history as a factor, the hidden account, the concealment of marital assets, the documented pattern. All of it became part of the picture a judge was asked to look at. I am not a vindictive person by nature, but I believe in accuracy. I believe in having all the information on the table. The final agreement was fair, more than fair, given the full picture. The house was sold. I got a portion that allowed me to put a down payment on a smaller place in the same school district, so Eli didn't have to change schools. I got a settlement that took into account 9 years of financial management, 9 years of shouldering a disproportionate share of logistics, and the specific circumstances under which our marriage ended. Colin moved into an apartment. I do not know if he is still with Justine. I have not asked. There is one more thing I need to tell you. It is the part of this story that I almost didn't include, because it is the part that still makes me cry. Not from grief, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The week after my surgery, the week I was home recovering, still in pain, my mother making soup in the kitchen. Eli had done something at school. A project for his 2nd grade class. They'd been asked to write 3 sentences about someone they admired and illustrate it. Most kids did a parent or a superhero or a teacher. Eli had written about me. I found it tucked into his backpack by accident, weeks later, when I was looking for a permission slip. His handwriting was still the large, effortful print of a kid who hadn't fully made friends with cursive yet. It said, "My mom is sick, but she is still brave. She goes to work and makes sure I have snacks. When I'm scared, she tells me true things." He had drawn me, green crayon, standing very straight, with what I assume was meant to be a stethoscope but looked more like a lasso. There was a sun in the corner. There was a smaller figure next to me, holding my hand, which was him. I sat down on the hallway floor with that paper, and I stayed there for a while. Eli came and found me and asked if I was okay, with the specific concerned look small children get when adults behave unexpectedly. I told him I was more than okay. I told him it was the best thing anyone had ever made for me. I still have it. It is framed now, hanging in my bedroom in the smaller house in the same school district. I finished my follow-up treatment 8 months after the surgery. My last scan came back clear. I go in every 6 months now. I will for years, probably forever, the way you carry certain things forward regardless. But my doctor says the prognosis is good, and I have learned to hold that word good very carefully, like something that could spill. I am still a pharmacist. I still know exactly what everything costs. Eli is 9 now and has moved from dinosaurs to space. He can tell you the distance from Earth to Neptune in both miles and kilometers, which I find both exhausting and wonderful. He has a gap in his front teeth where a new one is coming in, and a laugh that fills rooms. I did not ruin my husband's life. That framing was never mine. What I did was stop subsidizing a version of our life that existed mostly for his benefit. Stop smoothing over the places where he had long since stopped showing up. And stop pretending that a marriage can hold when only one person is in it. He made his choices. I made mine. And then I made sure the accounting was accurate. I think about Eli's drawing sometimes when I feel like I handled things wrong, or too harshly, or not harshly enough. I think about she tells me true things. That is what I want to be. That is what I am working every day to remain. The sun was out last Saturday. I took Eli to the Science Museum. We stood in front of a model of the solar system for 45 minutes while he explained things to me in the patient, slightly condescending tone he has adopted when discussing space with adults. A woman nearby smiled at me over his head. I smiled back. On the drive home, he fell asleep in the back seat. One sock off for reasons I had stopped trying to understand, his head tipped against the window. I drove in the quiet and listened to him breathe, and I thought, this is what I was fighting for. Not the house. Not the settlement. Not even the satisfaction of having the accounting come out right. This. Just this. People ask me sometimes, friends mostly, the ones who knew us as a couple, whether I feel guilty about how things ended. Whether I think I was too calculated, too cold. Whether a woman who loved her husband should have fought harder, forgiven faster, tried longer. I used to rehearse answers to those questions. Now I don't. Here's what I actually believe after everything. The way things end is almost always a direct consequence of choices that were made long before the ending. Colin didn't become a man who leaves a hospital 90 minutes into his wife's surgery on the same day he'd booked a flight to Las Vegas. That didn't happen overnight. That was built slowly, decision by decision, over years. Every time he handed me a paycheck summary and walked away. Every time I rescheduled my own medical appointments because he had conflicts. Every time he said the right thing while doing the opposite. The man who sent me that text, "You're stronger than you think," while already in line at a departure gate had been practicing that version of himself for a long time. I just hadn't been willing to read the pattern clearly. And I had been practicing a version of myself too. The version who managed everything, explained everything, smoothed everything over, absorbed the weight of our shared life into my own body and kept moving. I was so good at holding things together that I'd made it structurally impossible for him to understand what would happen if I stopped. That is not self-blame. That is just honesty about how we built something that couldn't survive the truth. Eli drew me standing very straight with a lasso that was supposed to be a stethoscope. He wrote that I tell him true things. That is the part of this story that sits with me the longest, not the settlement, not the hidden credit card statements, not the 87 missed calls when the bank notice arrived. It's that my 7-year-old son, in the middle of the hardest year of our lives, identified the quality in me he trusted most, not strength in the way people usually mean it. Toughness, stoicism, the ability to push through. He meant something quieter. He meant that when he was scared and came to me with a real question, I didn't soften it into something easier. I told him the true thing. That is what I want to carry forward. Not the divorce, not the financial reckoning, not the very satisfying moment Colin realized he didn't know the online banking login. Those things were necessary and I don't regret them. But they were the accounting, not the meaning. The meaning is this: what you consistently do, not what you say, not what you intend, not what you believe about yourself in your most generous moments, is what you actually are. Colin consistently chose himself. I consistently chose to tell true things. Both of those patterns followed long enough, produced exactly the life each of us is living now. I am not going to tell you my life is easy. Eli is 9 and full of questions about space, and I am going to every 6-month scan for probably the rest of my life. There are nights I am tired in a way that doesn't fully resolve with sleep. But I live in a house where the accounting is honest, where what I say and what I do match, where a kid in dinosaur print sheets trusts that when he asks me something real, I will answer him true. That is not nothing. That is in fact the whole thing.